of financial life was the prohibition of private citizens owning gold. Now, at this point, except for personal jewelry, at this point, this seems probably an abstract metaphysical thing, but up till 1933, you could take your gold, you could sell your dollars for gold, or you could sell your gold for dollars, and the gold and dollars were always floating against each other. The government declared that an ounce of gold was worth $35 an ounce. If anybody, a gold trader, domestic or international, didn't like it, they could go jump in a lake. That's what it was going to be. And because of the power of the U.S. economy, even in a depressed global economy, the $35 an ounce stuck, and it remained until, I think, 1971 or 72, when Nixon allowed the dollar to float. And the Federal Reserve Board was pushed into following inflationary policies to cheapen the cost of outstanding loans and speed off the reduction of debt loads. Because they figured that one of the main problems, well, they wanted to slow down speculation. The other side of that problem was that the basic aspects of the economy were happening too slowly. People were not spending the money that they should for everyday things. So the other thing that they wanted to do was stimulate production, which had been coming to a stop at the time that Roosevelt was inaugurated. They wanted to increase consumption. Hoover also saw this as an important goal, but the best he could do for this, given his belief that the federal government should have no role in the lives of individual citizens, was to create a special organization for unemployment relief, which then collected private contributions and distributed them to the needy. FDR approached the question of stimulating production through a variety of job relief programs, which we'll get into. These would employ people who would then spend their money for rent, for food, for furniture, for gasoline. The more people that the federal government and the state governments and the local governments could employ, the more money would be circulating in the economy. And at the same time, these job relief programs would be providing work for people in factories, providing the equipment and the resources that would be utilized by the federal programs. Second was the Social Security Act of 1935, which was to put guaranteed money into the hands of every senior citizen who would help stimulate the economy by going out and spending it on food, medicine, rent, clothing. Essentially, the Roosevelt administration defined the overproduction problem as one of underconsumption. The average consumer was not spending enough, was not consuming enough. You had to get them to spend more for basic, ordinary necessities. The Social Security Act, of course, also federalized a variety of state programs. There had been 45 different types of state old age pension programs that had existed prior to this, with 3 states not having any. And these state pension programs or state old age programs were very, very different from each other. The states that were the hardest hit in terms of the Depression often had the least viable, either had no or the least generous programs, where the states like Michigan and California, which were the least hit by the Depression, had the most generous of these programs. So one of the things was actually to create a national standard and to move money from the wealthier areas of the country into the poorer areas of the country. This was also a way of buying off Southern support, because while the Southern congressmen were very tight money oriented and they didn't want to vote in favor of spending hikes, somehow or other they found it not such a bad thing to do if a disproportionate share of the money was going to be spent in the South. But with wages in the South at 60%, in 1934, wages in the South were at 60% of what they were in the North and the Midwest and the Far West. The South was in desperate need of cash infusions to keep their economy going. Part of stimulating production was to promote unionization, which certainly had a social justice aspect. But if you're going to get people to spend, average working person to spend more money, you have to get their employers to grant them more money or to agree to pay them more money. And unionization seemed to be an essential way of regularizing the relationship of the employer and the employee, so employees as a group of people could expect increased wages. So it's not simply a question of promoting unions for the sake of unions. The National Labor Relations Act had a central part in a strategy of growing the incomes of people towards the bottom, in the middle and the bottom of the economy, so they would have more money to spend. And then the National Housing Act, which was to address the construction industry essentially shut down in 1929. It remained shut down until World War II. Federal relief projects employed those people who knew how to do dams and roads, but the building construction people, who were a sizable percentage of the unemployed, remained unemployed because of the paucity of work during the 30s. And so by getting the federal government to become a provider of housing, it could then employ unemployed carpenters and bricklayers and so forth to build housing for the poor and lower middle class. Also, as part of this, to stimulate housing production was the generalization of the 30-year mortgage. Typically, before this period, mortgages had been 5 years, 10 years, 15 years was supermax. So 5 years was very common for most people. When they bought a house, you got a mortgage and you had to pay it off in 5 years. With the 30-year mortgage, you could people with a lower income would be able to buy a house. And all of this would stimulate more construction, not simply of the homes that people live in, but of shopping centers to where those homes are being built, of schools, and so on. And at this time, the redevelopment agencies were formed across the country with federal authorization that had the power to assemble large packets of land, clear land titles that were ambiguous because of the economic crisis, and to get the real estate sector of the economy going again. So, one of the big things that people understood was underlying the equation, the Depression, was the aging capital, aging infrastructure. And the government in particular could address the infrastructure questions. So Hoover already spent quite a bit of money on dam and flood control projects. It's one of the reasons why Hoover Dam near Las Vegas is called Hoover Dam. And he also provided federal money to develop a national highway system. Particularly, he liked the federal government to pay for the bridges and the tunnels. And in 1932, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was founded to help private industry upgrade their capital by providing government subsidized loans to private industry. Now, Roosevelt did much, much more in terms of infrastructure, and what he did also involved creating a lot of new jobs. So, Federal Emergency Relief Administration, 1.5 million people employed to help cities and states do public works, build reservoirs, build libraries, build schools, build police stations. Civil Works Administration, hire 500,000 miles of roads constructed across the country, 40,000 new schools, 1,000 airports. The federal government, airports traditionally had been something that either state and local governments did or private business did. The federal government takes over management of the air transportation system. At the same time, the federal government starts getting involved in education, where it had never been before, by providing money to hire teachers in those parts of the country where the local government could not afford to pay for teachers. And it also promoted the expansion of adult education classes. Now, one of the aspects of the Depression is that young people stopped going to work. They were probably the first people to be affected by this. Now, if your family was working or someone in your family was working, well, you had more time. Young working class men in particular left school at the end of junior high, and they went to work in a factory or construction site or whatever. The 30s is the decade in which all men start to continue on to high school, and high school became a norm for men as well as women. So high school becomes the accepted part of life cycle development in the 1930s during the Depression, because what else are you going to do? At the same time, college education expands. The number of people going to college increases. In effect, this is infrastructure development, because what the country was doing was investing in its human resources. It was elevating the literacy standards, the qualitative thinking standards of its population, the skill standards. This has been credited as an important part of the country shifting from an industrial to a service economy and becoming the high-tech pioneer that it would become during and after the war. You had a much larger percentage of the workforce with a much higher level of education than previous. Public Works Administration built all sorts of things. Civilian Conservation Corps was the alternative for working class men who didn't want to go to school. You would be inducted into something that functioned something like the Army. You would get paid some money, you would get a bed, you would get food, you would get a uniform, and you were sent out to Yosemite or Mount Shasta, and you did reforestation projects, or you helped build a dam, or roads, and you were employed directly by the federal government. The Works Progress Administration was another thing where there were unemployed groups of people, and the government simply employed them to do what they were going to do. So 3 million people a year were working on special projects. Now, the most famous, what's been written about, is that you had a whole lot of writers and artists who couldn't get work during the Depression, so the government just hired them. So they would go, the better known of them were told, go home and write a novel. The junior ones were said, here's an